Hi, my name is Emiel Ramakers and this is a session on the Oracle Database Service for Azure, or ODSA. This particular session will be on one of the advanced topics, namely how to plug ODSA into a hub and spoke network on the Azure side. So what I'll do is I'll do a little bit of an overview of what that looks like and what are the important bits to understand about ODSA when you want to plug that into a hub and spoke network on the Azure side, and then we'll have a look at what that actually looks like in practice on the ODSA console and in Azure. As I said, this is the third in a four-part series, and in some of the other sessions we've had a look at the introduction, and then we've had a look at some of the more deep dive topics, how the ODSA architecture looks like, and in a future session we'll also have a look at disaster recovery and high availability. So I hope you enjoy this. Okay, so let's start with having a look at hub and spoke networks first, and how to connect ODSA into such a hub and spoke network. So you can do that in Azure in a number of ways, and the traditional way is based on peering. So in that setup you would have a hub VNet, and in that hub VNet you would have a routing device such as a firewall, and you would have applications deployed in spoke VNets, and all of those spoke VNets are paired individually with the hub VNet. So the routing between the spoke VNets always has to run through the hub VNet. And normally in Azure you cannot automatically speak to a pair of a pair, which is why in the hub VNet you need this routing device in the middle. So if you want to go from spoke VNet 1 to spoke VNet 2, you would go from spoke VNet 1 into the hub VNet, so your route table would have to show to go into the hub VNet, specifically into a firewall or other routing device in that hub VNet, and from there that routing device would send you on to the VNet where you actually want to be. So typically when we talk about ODSA and Azure Hub and Spoke networks, it is because a customer will already have a setup like that, and they have to plumb ODSA into that. The normal way of doing that is to basically attach ODSA to the hub VNet, which then means that with the right routing setup, we can make that available to each of the spokes, or especially each of the spokes that need to access that database. An alternative would be to plumb ODSA into one of the spokes, but then of course only that spoke will have access to that database. If that is enough, then that's an option. You then see ODSA as an extension of the spoke. But the normal way that we see most customers do this is to plumb ODSA into the hub VNet and make it accessible to any of the spokes that need access to it. An alternative to hub and spoke networks, or an alternative way to do hub and spoke networks in Azure, is to use the Azure Virtual WAN. That's a bit more modern than the peering-based hub and spokes, and that is basically a bit like networking using the OCI DRG v2, for those who are familiar more with OCI than with Azure. The problem with that is that that is currently not supported for ODSA, so you cannot plumb ODSA into a virtual WAN hub and make it accessible to the other elements that connect to that virtual WAN hub. So it is important when you speak to a customer and when you speak about ODSA that you find out what their networking in Azure is like, because if they are heavy users of Azure Virtual WAN, then the advice is really to come and talk to the specialist team, and through the specialist team we can talk to the product management team and really try to work out how to best support that use case for that particular customer, because out of the box that certainly is not supported currently for ODSA. So going back to the peering-based hub and spoke, the traditional hub and spoke model, let's just go and have a look at a little picture. So this is an example that we saw in one of the previous sessions as well, and we have extended this now with some spoke VNets, and what we see here is the hub VNet and the spoke VNets in the Azure regions. That was probably already set up before ODSA even got a sniff at this. So spoke VNet 1 and spoke VNet 2, they talk to each, if they need to talk to each other, they speak through the hub VNet, and the root tables in those spoke VNets will point to the VNA or the firewall, whichever is the routing device in the hub, to gain access to the other side. So if we plumb ODSA into this, then the typical example, as I said earlier, is to attach it to the hub VNet. So during the creation of this database, we link it to the hub VNet. And one additional thing that we now need to do is we need to make sure that that ODSA router, which we've discussed in a previous session, but the ODSA router is in the ODSA leaf VNet. It's part of the ODSA control plane and is the first thing within ODSA that the traffic out of Azure reaches. And that ODSA router needs to know where to send the traffic. So during the creation of this ODSA database, we need to inform that of the IP address of our firewall or whatever the routing device is. And after that is done, the rest of the routing is then taken care of out of the hub VNet. And of course, for to gain access to that database from either of the spokes, you will also have to set up the root tables in those spokes to make sure that when they want to access the database, that they go to the firewall or the VNA, and from there the traffic will be routed onwards. So if we have a quick look at what that looks like when you create a database. So this is the ODSA console. I've got an overview of base databases here. If I create a new base database, I have all of the details that I have to fill in. I'm going to skip that now in the configuration where you tell it what the database shape is, etc. The important thing here is networking. So in networking, you would typically select a virtual network. That, in this case, you're going to select your hub VNet. For example, in this case, I know that my VNet 4 here is actually a hub VNet that connects to the spokes 4B and 4C. We'll have a look at that later, actually. The important thing then, so I can select that. The important thing that I was saying earlier, if you set up connectivity to a hub and spoke setup, you have to fill in your network virtual appliance here. So here you give it the IP address of your firewall or other network virtual appliance that is in your hub VNet that does the routing of the traffic. So after that is filled in, you will then gain access from all of your spokes to this database. And of course, normally you also fill in the OCI CIDR and you fill in everything else to go and create this database. So when you look at how that looks after you've created that in Azure, so if you have your virtual network, as I said, I've set one up earlier. So here is my VNet 4. I've got a spoke B and a spoke C. So if I have a look at those spokes first, if I have a look at the pairings, I already had a pairing to go from 4B to 4. And in 4C, I already have a pairing to go from 4C to 4. I also have a pairing for something else which is irrelevant at this moment. And in 4, I can have a look at these pairings and I can see a bunch of pairings here. So I have a pairing from 4 to 4B and from 4 to 4C. That's the reverse of the ones that I already showed. And also I have two pairings to two ODSA databases. We've had a look at the detail of how that works in one of the other sessions as well. But I can see that this is connected to two ODSA databases, and therefore from these paired spoke networks, I will be able to gain access to those. So the only thing that I need to make sure of is that my root tables for those spokes are set up in the correct way to point to my routing device that is running in that hub. I need to maybe set up some network security groups to allow the traffic, etc. I need to make sure that that is all allowed, and then that will all work fine. So that is how to set up a ODSA connection to a hub and spoke network in the easiest way.